everyone, my name is Megan, and today we're going to talk about all the books that I read in the month of January. So January was a pretty great reading month for me in terms of quantity. I read 13 books this month, which is probably the most that I've ever read in a month. So I'm not going to waste your time with any long intros. I'm just going to get into it and we're going to talk about all the books I read and what I thought of them. My first read of 2020 was The Family Upstairs by Lisa Jewell. This book primarily follows a girl named Libby who suddenly inherits a house that she knows. This house seems to kind of have a pretty dark history, and we're also given a couple other different perspectives and timelines throughout the book to get some more clarity of what exactly happened in this house and why it came to be Libby. I think this is my third or fourth Lisa Jewell that I've read, and I think this is my favorite of hers that I've read so far. It was so dark and creepy and mysterious, and it kind of left off on a little bit of a suspicious note, which I always really enjoy in thrillers. I did think that the pacing was a little bit off with this one. I thought the ending was really rushed, and there was kind of some weird romance stuff in here that I didn't think was completely necessary. But overall, I thought it was a really strong thriller. If you're a fan of Ruth Ware and you haven't picked up a Lisa Jewell book, I definitely recommend picking up this one because I think a lot of people who really like a lot of Ruth Ware's books would really like this one as well. I gave this book 4 out of 5 stars. The next book that I read was After I Do by Taylor Jenkins Reid. If you watched my favorite books of 2019 video, you'll know that Taylor Jenkins Reid was featured on that list not once but twice. I feel like when I just want a book that I know I'm really gonna like, something that I'm really gonna be able to fly through, some characters that I'm gonna love, I pick up Taylor Jenkins Reid. And that's exactly what I wanted this time. This book tells the story of Lauren and Ryan, who are a married couple that have been together since they were in college. After being married for several years, they kind of start having some issues, and they decide together to take a trial separation of 1 year. Their agreement dictates that they don't contact each other for a full year, and that they live separate lives and reconvene a year later to decide what they ultimately want to do. This book was pretty hard for me emotionally to read. I got married back in September, so I am very much still in the newlywed stage of life. And so reading this book, seeing how close Lauren and Ryan were, how their relationship started out, how wonderful everything was, and then how everything crumbled, reading that right after getting married maybe wasn't the best thing to read, but it was still just such a beautiful and unconventional love story. I thought that the character development, again, was so beautiful in this book. Taylor Jenkins Reid is just queen of character development, in my opinion, and Lauren was no exception. I loved her so much. I rooted for her the whole time. By the end of this book, my heart was so full after it had been broken, and I highly recommend this one. I gave this one a 4.5 out of 5 stars. Next up, I read The Grace Year by Ken Liggett. This is a YA dystopian that takes place in a world where the 16th year of every girl's life is called their grace year, and they're kind of banished off into the woods for that year so that their magic doesn't take over and control all the men, because, of course, some girls return from their grace year and get married and live lives as every woman should. Other girls are killed by poachers or by the elements, so it's a pretty dangerous time of any young woman's life. Before I picked this book up, I heard it compared to The Lord of the Flies, and I definitely see that comparison. It was much more of a survival story than I had anticipated. I don't think I realized that when they were banished, they were banished. I guess I kind of thought that they went somewhere and were contained, but no, they were just sent away. So I wasn't really expecting as much of the survival story as I got. I also thought that the pacing was really off in this one. I was kind of bored reading probably the first 3/4 of this book. Not a ton happened. It was really slow. And then the last, I would say 100 pages, probably even less, a ton of stuff happens, and it's just so hard to follow. There's also a romance in this that I really did not care for in any way, shape, or form, so that didn't help. Overall, I really did like a lot of the things that this book was trying to say. I thought that it focused a lot on how women need to support women in order to succeed, and I think that that is 100% true and something that we should be reinforcing as much as possible. Ultimately, this book was not as powerful as I had hoped it would be, and it was pretty forgettable as well. I gave this book a 3 out of 5 stars. Next, I read my book of the month pick for the month of January, which was The Sundown Motel by Simone St. James. This book follows 2 alternate timelines. The first one is in 1982, and it follows Viv, who is working at the Sundown Motel right before she mysteriously disappeared. The second timeline is 2017, and we're following Carly, who is Viv's niece, as she tries to piece together what happened to her aunt back in the 80s. I was really looking forward to this one because I felt like it was pitched perfectly for me. It's a thriller that's for fans of true crime and for armchair detectives like I sometimes like to think that I am. So it sounded really interesting to me, and it sounded really creepy as well. Unfortunately, this one landed pretty flat for me. There were so many points in this book where everything just worked out so conveniently, which a lot of times I can really overlook in thrillers because I realize it's a book, things are going to be convenient, it's fiction, it happens. But I feel like it just happened too many times, so that dragged the book down for me. Also, this is one of those books where there are kind of some supernatural elements, but are there really? Which I generally really like in thrillers, but I felt like it really didn't work super well in this book. It came across as being really cheesy and not scary at all in the slightest. Honestly, this book just didn't make a ton of sense to me, and I was pretty let down by it. I gave it a 2.5 out of 5 stars. Next up, I read The Outsider by Stephen King. I feel like I'm in this lifelong quest to find a Stephen King book that I really love, because I really do want to love Stephen King. I love horror, and Stephen King is the king of horror, so it makes sense that I would love him. I don't dislike him or anything. I've read several of his books, and I've liked them well enough, but I want to find one that I love. So I was hoping that this would be one that I loved because it sounded super interesting to me, but I didn't love it. Let me back up for a second and talk about what this book is about. This book takes place in a small town where a young boy is found brutally murdered. Luckily, there's a ton of evidence present at the crime scene, and everything points to a beloved coach in the town named Terry Maitland. If Terry Maitland's DNA hadn't been found at the scene, he would have never been considered a suspect. And also, he has a rock-solid alibi. This book just follows the case as they try to figure out what happened to Frank, and if Terry Maitland was really involved, and if not, how was all of this evidence at the scene of the crime. While I didn't love this book, I didn't dislike it at all. I gave it a 3.5 out of 5 stars. I really liked the first half, or most of the first half of the book. I wasn't really satisfied with the conclusion of this one, and I felt like I invested so much time reading this book. This is a pretty thick book. This is a 40 page book. So I spent a lot of time, and I just didn't feel like the payoff was really worth it. I did feel like it might have felt a little too gratuitously gory, and I didn't feel like all of the details that were shared in this book needed to be shared, but it was a pretty interesting read. It was an exciting read. It kept me on my toes for most of the book at least. So I would recommend it if you think it sounds interesting, or if you like Stephen King. Like it says on this super annoying unremovable sticker thing on the front, this is an HBO miniseries that I think just started. So if it sounds interesting to you, maybe check it out on HBO and see if you like it before committing to quite a long book. My next read was Long Bright River by Liz Moore. This book follows a police officer named Mickey who lives in a town that is severely impacted by the heroin epidemic. Mickey's younger sister Casey has struggled with addiction for years and has also dabbled in sex work. Suddenly, sex workers in the area are being murdered, and Mickey is super worried about her sister Casey. So she calls in help from her old partner Truman, and this story kind of follows them figuring out if Casey is safe and what is happening to all of these women in the city. This book was very powerful. I feel like it discussed a lot of really heavy but really important topics, such as the heroin epidemic. But more importantly than that, I think that my favorite part of this book was reading it from a police officer's perspective. In this book, Mickey is put face to face with the police corruption and the abuse of power that exists among her coworkers. And it was interesting to kind of see a police officer realize that not all police officers are in it for the right reasons. Like I said, it was extremely powerful, super emotional. I think that this book is largely being targeted as a thriller. While it definitely has many aspects of a mystery thriller, I think that going into this and expecting the same thing you would get out of a Ruth Ware or a Lisa Jewell would do this book an injustice. It is much more of a slower burn than a lot of other thrillers, and so sometimes it seems a little slow to read, but I did find that powering through it was definitely worth it. I gave this book 4 out of 5 stars. All right, the next book that I want to talk about is Serpent and Dove by Shelby Mahurin. I'm kind of nervous to talk about this one because I know that a lot of people really loved this one, but I really, really did not like this one at all. I'm trying to think of a good way to describe this book, but I feel like I blocked a lot of it out of my memory, if I'm being completely honest. Basically, all you need to know about this book is it's about a witch who falls in love with a witch hunter. I wish somebody would have just pitched that to me, just that one line to me, and I would have gone into this book with completely different expectations. When I picked this book up, I was hoping for a witchy fantasy with a little bit of romance. Sure, I don't mind that at all. I don't even mind enemies to lovers romances. Whatever, that's fine. But that is literally all this book is about, pretty much. I think my biggest complaint with this book was the world building was just not there at all. World building should be important in a fantasy novel, even if the focus is more on the characters than it is the plot. If I'm reading a fantasy, I need world building, and I got almost none of that from this book. There's plenty of space in this book for there to be world building, but you won't find it in these pages. I wouldn't go into this one expecting much of a fantasy, but if you are interested in enemies to lovers romances and it sounded interesting to you, I would definitely pick it up. I think I would have enjoyed it more if I went in knowing what it really was and not expecting lots of cool witchy fantasy stuff to happen. I gave this book 2 out of 5 stars, and that's honestly me being pretty generous. The next book that I read was I'll Never Tell by Catherine McKenzie. This book follows 5 adult siblings as they reconvene at their childhood home for the reading of their parents' will. The childhood home is on a campground where they had summer camp, and back in the 90s there was a horrible accident that pretty much shut down the camp. When the lawyer reads the will to the siblings, some accusations come to light, and it brings up this incident all over again, and it causes all the siblings to re-examine what really happened that summer. Ultimately, I liked this. I thought it was interesting. I do think there might have been a couple too many perspectives in this novel because it followed all of the siblings along with the groundskeeper. So that's 6 different perspectives, and this book wasn't that long, so I felt like I got some of the siblings confused, and it was just kind of hard to keep everyone straight in this book. Also, I felt like it just wasn't super memorable. With thrillers, I'm looking for something that really packs a punch, that really delivers something unique. And this was just your run-of-the-mill thriller to me. I gave it 3 out of 5 stars. The next book that I read in January was The Bookish Life of Nina Hill by Abby Waxman. So we obviously follow Nina Hill in this one, who works at an independent bookstore. Nina grew up with a single mother who wasn't really in her life very often and knew nothing about her biological father until one day when a lawyer comes to tell her that her biological father knew who she was all along and has passed away. The lawyer also tells Nina that her father left her something in his will. Yes, January 2020 was my month of using a will as a plot device. What a good month, what a good month. So because she must go to the reading of the will, she is forced to confront all of her new family, and she has this super huge kind of crazy family that she now has to contend with when she's for so long been used to it just being her. This book also has a romance aspect of it, which honestly took up more of the book than I had hoped it would. I was a lot more interested in learning more about the family and figuring out what was left in the will for Nina than I was the romance. But the romance was still pretty cute, so I didn't mind it too much. As you can imagine, there are a ton of bookish quotes and bookish references in this book, which as a book reader I enjoyed, but it did feel a little heavy-handed at times, and I kind of got tired of it. So I can't imagine that somebody who isn't as into books as I am would appreciate those references that much, but they were still fun. I also really enjoyed reading from a perspective of somebody who has a pretty similar job. In this book, Nina does story times, which is one of my favorite things about being a librarian is doing story times, so that was really fun to read. Overall, it was a cute and fun read, but ultimately not a favorite of mine or anything. I gave it somewhere between a 3 and a 3.5 out of 5 stars. The next book that I read was The Starlight Sea by Erin Morgenstern, and ladies and gentlemen, I have found a new favorite book of all time. This book is super hard to explain. It is so dense and so rich and so beautiful that I just think everyone should just read it, regardless of what it's about, but I will try to explain it at least a little bit. The Starlight Sea is kind of like a parallel universe that consists entirely of stories in every type of format imaginable. Obviously, there are books and other things like books, but there are also candies that as you eat them, you hear a story, you learn a story like in your brain. That's the craziest thing I've ever heard, but I want it to be real. Our main character in this book is Zachary Rollins, who is a grad student who finds a mysterious library book that details a story of a memory that he had as a child. He's obviously really freaked out to read this memory of his in a book from the library, and so he does some investigating, and that's how he ends up in the Starlight Sea. There's a lot more to this book than that, for sure. There are stories within stories. There are other characters that are just as beautiful and well developed as Zachary. This book was so inventive, so creative. Some of the most beautiful prose that I've read in recent memory. I've read Erin Morgenstern's debut, The Night Circus, as has everybody else, and I loved that one, but I think I actually liked this one even more. I know some people find it slow, and I get that because it is really weird and you kind of have to suspend disbelief. So if you're willing to suspend your disbelief a little bit, if you're willing to kind of just go through it and accept whatever happens, I definitely recommend this book. It's definitely a little bit pretentious, but I like things that are pretentious. I don't really know what that says about me, but if that's not something that would bother you either, I definitely recommend checking this out. If I could give this book more than 5 stars, I definitely would. This is a YA contemporary that follows 2 best friends, Jasmine and Chelsea, who live in Harlem, New York, and go to a social justice focused high school. The school in this book requires the students to participate in a social justice cause as school credit, which I thought was really cool. So the main point of this book is Chelsea and Jasmine trying to start their own club dedicated to women's rights. This book was very powerful and very emotional, and I think it's a really important book and a great example to young people of how they can work on making a difference. Actually, one of the things I really loved about this book was in the back, in the back it has resources for young activists where they're given some poets, some blogs, and books all about activism, which I think is really awesome. There were parts of it that I really loved. I loved Jasmine as a character. I loved reading from her perspective. I loved her family. Jasmine talked a lot about being a fat Black girl, which I thought was wonderful. I loved everything she had to say about weight and stigma behind gaining weight and being fat. It's something that is very important to discuss, and so I was so happy to see it so beautifully discussed in this book. I found Chelsea's character to be really frustrating, and I was hoping she would develop a lot more. I didn't see as much development from Chelsea as I had hoped, which was pretty disappointing just given the atmosphere of the book. But other than that, I really did enjoy this book. I thought it was a really great representation of young activism, and I'm thrilled that a book like this exists. I gave this 4 out of 5 stars. Next up, I read Such a Fun Age by Kylie Reed. I feel like this book kind of just popped up all of a sudden. Obviously, it's a Reese's Book Club pick, so that's probably part of it, but I feel like I hadn't heard anything about this book. I didn't know that it was coming at all, and then all of a sudden it was everywhere. And I heard really great things about it. I heard such good reviews, so I was really excited to pick it up. But unfortunately, I did not care for this one. This book starts out with our main character, Amira, being accused by a security officer at a supermarket of kidnapping the girl that she is nannying because Amira is Black and the girl she's nannying is white. This book kind of just follows the aftermath of that event. There's also kind of a romance plotline in this one where Amira starts dating somebody from the woman she nannies for's past. The woman that she nannies for and the guy that she dates are both trying to convince Amira that the other one is no good and racist. So Amira is trying to figure out what the deal with that is. Honestly, in the end, I was just pretty bored with this one. I felt like nothing really happened, and while I'm fine with books that are just about characters and nothing happens, I feel like the characters themselves weren't interesting enough to keep this book floating. This book did talk about something, though, that I've never seen talked about in a book before, and that was Amira's fear of not finding a full-time job before she turns 26 and is kicked off her parents' health insurance, because that happened to me. I've been there. It's scary. It's a really realistic portrayal of being 25 in 2016, I think is when this book takes place. So I definitely appreciated that. But other than that, honestly, it just really didn't do anything for me. I gave it 2 out of 5 stars. All right, guys, we have finally made it to the end. We are at my last book that I read in the month of January, and that is We Wish You Luck by Caroline Zankin. This book follows a group of MFA grad students as they do their first couple of residencies for their program. This particular program is 2 residencies a year, one in June and one in January. During the rest of the year, they just send off their progress on their work to their advisors, but they all meet face-to-face twice a year for their residencies. There are a lot of characters in this book, but our main characters are probably Hannah and Leslie, who are 2 very different students who form a relationship with another mysterious student named Jimmy. In between their first and second residencies, something pretty tragic happens, so this book is mostly just showing how the students at the school responded to this incident before, during, and after the incident occurred. I think the most interesting thing about this book was the perspective. It was told from the perspective of the entire class altogether, and it was told almost exclusively in gossip that was told from one student to another. While the book largely follows Hannah and Leslie, we don't actually hear from Hannah and Leslie at all firsthand. We are told entirely about them through the eyes of their classmates. I think that's all I'm going to say about this one. It's kind of complicated to talk about, and I don't want to spoil anything or take anything away from anyone who might want to read this one. But I would definitely go into it if you like lyrical writing, if you like books set on a college campus, which I tend to really like books set on a college campus for some reason. I would say if you are a fan of Sally Rooney, you'd probably enjoy this writing. If you liked If We Were Liars by ML Rio, there are some similarities in this one as well. It was definitely weird though, so I know this book isn't going to be for everyone, but I really loved this book. I gave this book 4.5 out of 5 stars. All right, everyone, those are all of the books that I read in the month of January. Let me know in the comments below if you've read any of these books and what you thought of them, and also let me know what your favorite book you read in January was. In the description below, you'll also find a link to my Goodreads page, which you can follow to get updates on what I'm reading and how I'm liking it. You can also follow my Bookstagram at Megan Likes Books and my Twitter account at Meg Likes Books. Thanks so much everyone for watching. I will see you guys very soon with another video. Bye-bye.